Welcome to Audiobooks. Immerse yourself in the world of stories, ideas, and knowledge, all through the power of audio.
Book title: Victorian Ghost Stories for Winter Nights.
Chapter 1. Fireside Whispers. Winter has always been the season of ghosts. When the nights grow long and the earth lies frozen in silence, the living gather close together, drawn to the hearth by instinct. Fire crackles, candles flicker, and the shadows they cast dance upon the walls as if remembering things that once were. In the Victorian age, long before electric light or moving pictures, this ritual became more than comfort, it became tradition. For what better time to summon tales of spirits than the season when the veil is thinnest and the world itself feels hushed with expectation? Imagine, then, a parlor in some London townhouse, its curtains drawn tight against the snow drifting in the streets outside. The lamps are dimmed, only the fire offers its golden glow. A group sits in a circle, ladies wrapped in shawls, gentlemen with pipes at hand, children leaning forward wide-eyed. Outside, the wind howls like some lost soul at the window. Inside, voices lower to whispers, for a ghost story is never told in haste. It must be woven carefully, as if calling the dead to join the company. Victorians loved their ghosts. They loved them because they lived in an age of unease. Old beliefs had begun to crumble beneath the weight of science, yet questions of the soul refused to vanish. Railways sped across the countryside, factories thundered, cities grew thick with smoke, and yet in the quiet of the drawing room a candle guttered just as it always had, and shadows still stirred in the corners. Progress could not banish dread. Indeed, the faster the world seemed to turn, the more certain people became that something waited in the darkness. The winter ghost story was both warning and comfort. It told listeners that the dead were never far away, that loss and sorrow might echo beyond the grave, but it also reminded them that death was not silence. Ghosts spoke. Ghosts lingered. And in the stillness of December nights, one might almost welcome them, if only for the company. Consider how it would feel. The coal fire hissing, a log collapsing into embers, the soft tick of the mantel clock marking each second. Someone clears their throat. A tale begins, perhaps of a widow who hears footsteps in an empty hall, or a bride whose laughter carries through the snow long after she has vanished. The listeners draw closer. The room seems colder. For a moment, no one dares to turn their head toward the darkened doorway, lest something should be standing there. And when the story ends, there is silence. The kind of silence that presses heavy, as if the house itself is listening. Then someone laughs too loudly, or a child squeals, and the spell is broken. But not entirely, because when the lights are at last extinguished, when the bedchambers are dark and the fire gone cold, the story stirs again. A creak on the staircase, a brush of wind against the glass, a whisper that might be memory or something more. It is here, on such nights, that our journey begins. The Victorians told their ghost stories in parlors and country houses, in letters and magazines, in hushed tones at midnight. And tonight we shall join them. We will walk their snowbound lanes, step into their mist-choked streets, sit in their drawing rooms where the curtains are pulled tight against the night. One by one, we will hear the tales they whispered by firelight, and in doing so, we may discover that their ghosts are not as distant as they seem. So let the fire burn low, let the night grow deep. Draw your chair closer, for the hour has come. The dead are waiting, and they have stories to tell. Chapter 2. The Phantom Carriage. On a stormy night, a country doctor hears wheels on the lane long after midnight. The carriage that passes his window is drawn by black horses with no driver. When he follows, he finds the carriage stops only at homes where death waits. On a bitter night in the winter of 1864, Dr. James Ashcroft was roused from his slumber by a sound he knew well, the iron-shod wheels of a carriage rattling along the frozen lane outside his country home. At first he thought nothing of it. Carriages passed his house often enough, though rarely at such an hour. The mantel clock had just struck 2. He lay back, but then the sound came again. The steady clatter of wheels, the snap of reins, the thud of hooves on hard ground. It drew nearer, echoing against the hedgerows. Curiosity gnawed at him. Ashcroft was not a man easily disturbed. He had seen more death in his years as a physician than most. Yet there was something unnatural in the rhythm of those wheels, something hollow in the way the hooves struck the road. Rising, he went to the window and pulled back the curtain. What he saw froze him as surely as the frost upon the glass. A carriage sped along the lane, its shape blacker than the night around it. The horses were dark as shadows, their eyes like embers, their breath steaming in great plumes that seemed too thick, too heavy to be of this world. No driver sat at the box, and yet the whip cracked in the air. The carriage did not slow, nor did it swerve. It glided with dreadful purpose, the wheels striking sparks where no sparks should be. Ashcroft's gaze followed it as it thundered past. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone, swallowed by the snow and silence. Only the faint echo of wheels lingered in the night air. Shaken, he returned to bed, telling himself it was a dream, a trick of exhaustion. Yet the next morning he heard grim news. A farmer in the next village had died in his sleep. A trivial coincidence, perhaps, but when, the following night, the carriage returned and passed once more along the lane, and another villager was found dead at dawn, Ashcroft began to wonder. On the third night, the doctor resolved to face the thing. He lit his lantern and stood by the roadside, breath rising in white clouds as he waited. The village lay still, roofs heavy with snow, the world hushed. Then came the sound, wheels, hooves, the phantom whip. Out of the mist it came, black and gleaming, lanterns burning with no flame. As it drew level with him, the carriage slowed. The horses stamped, their breath curling like smoke around his head. And though no driver held the reins, the door swung open with a groan. Inside sat nothing but darkness, darkness so deep it seemed to pulse, to beckon. Yet within it, Ashcroft thought he glimpsed faces, pale, hollow, eyes closed in eternal sleep. He stepped back, heart hammering, clutching his lantern as though its light could protect him. The door shut. The carriage lurched forward, the horses whinnying with an unearthly cry, and it was gone once more. That night, a woman in the village succumbed to fever. Dr. Ashcroft never again waited by the road, but in the years that followed, he heard the wheels often. Sometimes they passed his house, sometimes they did not. And always, the next day, he was called to pronounce someone dead. The villagers came to believe that the phantom carriage was a messenger of fate, a herald of the grave. But Ashcroft knew better. It was no messenger. It was a collector. Chapter 3. The Governess and the Gray Lady.
A governess arrives at a remote estate to care for two children who insist they are being watched from the garden. She laughs it off until she glimpses a veiled figure staring up at the nursery windows. Soon, the house's tragic history rises from the grave. When Miss Eleanor Price accepted her post as governess at Greystone Manor, she imagined a respectable appointment in a fine house, far from the soot and noise of London. The manor stood on the edge of the moors, tall and stern against the winter sky, its chimneys trailing smoke into the wind. Inside, she found her charges two pale children with solemn eyes who spoke in whispers, as though the very walls might overhear them. The housekeeper, Mrs. Harlow, greeted Eleanor warmly enough, though her gaze was quick to wander to the windows. "It's a lonely place in winter," she said, almost apologetically. "But you'll grow used to it. Everyone does." Eleanor's days passed in lessons and recitations, arithmetic and copywork. Yet she soon noticed peculiar habits in the children. Whenever dusk fell, they would draw the curtains tight and refuse to play by the nursery windows. If she asked why, they only shook their heads. One evening, pressed by curiosity, she persisted. "It's her," whispered the little girl at last. "The Gray Lady." Eleanor smiled, as one does at childish inventions. But that night, as she pidied the nursery, she felt the prickle of being watched. Turning, she glimpsed a figure in the garden below, a woman, tall and thin, draped in gray, her face veiled. She stood perfectly still, staring up at the window. And when Eleanor blinked, the garden was empty. The next morning, Eleanor mentioned the sight to Mrs. Harlow, who dropped the teacup in her hand. "You saw nothing," the housekeeper said sharply. "Best not to speak of it again." Her trembling fingers betrayed her. Yet the sightings continued. At twilight, the Gray Lady lingered by the hedgerows or drifted along the path toward the chapel ruins at the edge of the estate. Sometimes Eleanor thought she saw the woman within the house itself, her reflection passing in the tall mirrors, her figure gliding across the landing. The children grew ever more anxious, clinging to her skirts, begging her not to leave them alone. Determined to uncover the truth, Eleanor searched the manor's library. Among dusty ledgers and faded letters, she found fragments of the story, a former governess who had lived there 20 years before. The woman had fallen in love with the master of the house, though he was already married. When the affair was discovered, she was dismissed in disgrace. On a snowbound night, she walked into the moors, never to return. Her body was never found, only her gray cloak tangled in the brambles near the chapel. The discovery chilled her blood, for now she understood why the spirit lingered. The Gray Lady had returned to claim what was denied her. That very night, as a storm shook the manor, Eleanor awoke to the sound of the nursery door opening. The children whimpered in their beds. There, in the wavering glow of the fire, stood the Gray Lady, her veil lifting slowly. Beneath it was not a face of flesh, but a hollow mask of shadow, two pits where eyes should have been. She raised a hand, beckoning. Eleanor clutched the children to her and cried out, "You shall not have them!" At her words, the figure faltered, as if struck. The fire flared high, and with a hiss like wind through a graveyard, the Gray Lady dissolved into smoke. The house was quiet after that. The children no longer spoke of her, nor did Eleanor see her again. Yet on stormy nights, when the wind lashes the moors and the chapel bells toll faintly, though long disused, she sometimes dreams of the Gray Lady standing at the window, waiting, always waiting for her chance to be seen once more. Chapter 4. The Frozen Bride. A Gothic wedding tale. A bride vanishes on her wedding night during a snowstorm. For years, travelers near the old chapel hear her voice calling through the wind. When one stranger investigates, he discovers a body preserved in ice and a spirit that will not rest. There is a legend whispered in the villages along the Yorkshire moors, a tale told on winter nights when the snow lies deep and the wind moans through the churchyards. It is the story of Clara Whitcomb, the bride who vanished before she could ever take her vows. Clara was the daughter of a prosperous mill owner, known for her beauty as much as for her kindness. On the eve of her wedding, the whole town was alive with merriment. Candles glowed in every window, and sleigh bells rang in the frosted air as guests arrived at the old chapel where the ceremony was to be held. But the snow began to fall more heavily as night wore on, blanketing the moors and silencing the roads. By morning, Clara was gone. Some said she had fled the marriage. Others whispered of foul play. Her groom, a young barrister from Leeds, searched the countryside until his health failed, swearing he had heard her voice calling to him through the storm. Her father hired men to dig through the drifts, but they found nothing. No trace of footprints, no broken branches, no body. Clara Whitcomb was lost to the snow, and the wedding feast turned into a wake. Years passed, yet the story did not rest. Travelers crossing the moors on winter nights spoke of a young woman in a bridal gown, wandering through the snow, her veil torn and glittering with frost. Some swore they heard her weeping. Others claimed she asked for directions to the chapel, as if she still sought her groom. Few lingered to offer aid, for her eyes, they said, were pale as ice, and her skin whiter than the snow itself. One such traveler was Edmund Pritchard, a schoolmaster returning home from a holiday gathering. His horse shied suddenly, and there, standing in the road, was the bride herself. Her gown shimmered in the moonlight, stiff with ice, and her lips trembled as she whispered, "Help me, the snow has taken me." Though terror gripped him, Edmund was a man of reason. He dismounted and offered her his cloak. But when he placed it upon her shoulders, it passed through as though she were no more than mist. She looked up at him then, her eyes hollow, and he realized what he had done. He had touched the dead. The air grew colder, his breath turned to frost before his face, and in the silence he heard the faint sound of bells, the chapel bells that had not rung in 20 years. Clara reached for him, her hand brittle as ice, and he fled in terror, abandoning horse and cloak alike. He staggered into the village at dawn, frostbitten and half-mad, insisting that Clara's body still lay trapped beneath the snow, waiting to be freed. When searchers went to the old chapel ruins, they found, in the hollow of a drift, a figure encased in ice. It was the frozen body of a young woman, her gown preserved in crystalline frost, her face serene, as though still dreaming of her wedding day. The villagers gave her a burial at last, laying her in consecrated ground. Yet even so, on nights when the snow falls thick and heavy, the bells are said to toll faintly, and a pale bride can be seen wandering toward the chapel, forever seeking the vows she never spoke. Chapter 5. The Lamplighter's Shadow. In fog-choked London, a lamplighter notices another figure following him, extinguishing lamps as quickly as he lights them. The shadow grows bolder each night until the man realizes it is not human, but his own death given form. London in winter is a city of fog and flame. By day, smoke chokes the streets. By night, the gas lamps glow like watchful eyes, their light barely piercing the thick yellow haze. It was the task of men like Thomas Briggs to keep that glow alive. For 15 years, Briggs had walked his beat each evening, pole in hand, kindling the lamps one by one. He was a solitary man, his boots worn thin from miles of cobbled streets, his back stooped from years of trudging through soot and drizzle. The work was monotonous, yet comforting in its routine. A lamp lit here, a flame coaxed there, the city slowly blossoming with light against the darkness. But one night in December of 1872, he noticed something peculiar. As he lit the lamp on Holloway Lane, he glanced back and saw just for an instant the flame extinguish itself. He frowned, retraced his steps, and found the lamp dark as though it had never been touched. Muttering about faulty fittings, he relit it. Yet when he looked again, the flame guttered and died. The following night it happened again, not with one lamp, but several. As he moved down the street, striking flame after flame, a figure followed him just behind him, snuffing them out. He could not see the culprit clearly. It was a shape darker than the fog, a distortion of shadow that walked where no man should. Whenever he turned, it melted into the gloom, leaving only extinguished lamps in its wake. Briggs told no one. Who would believe him, a lamplighter frightened of shadows? Still, each evening the thing returned, pacing him, undoing his work. He grew desperate, hurrying his rounds, striking the flames with trembling hands, yet always the figure crept after him, patient and silent, swallowing the light. One evening, weary of fear, he resolved to confront it. At the corner of Camden Row he waited, lantern in hand. The fog thickened, muffling the rattle of carriages. And then it came. His own shadow, stretched long upon the paving stones, but not moving as he moved. It raised its head when he did not, lifted an arm when his remained still. "Who are you?" he whispered. His voice trembled, swallowed by the mist. Then, slowly, it lifted the lamplighter's pole, though Briggs's own hands were empty, and drove its flame into the nearest lamp. The light sputtered, flared, and died. Chapter 6. The Haunted Clock. A wealthy merchant inherits a magnificent grandfather clock from a dead relative. But the clock chimes at impossible hours, midnight, 3, 13, and with each strike another family member falls ill. The survivors wonder, is the clock cursed or possessed? In the winter of 1881, Mr. Jonathan Harbury inherited a fine townhouse on Bloomsbury Square upon the death of his uncle, a man of eccentric tastes and few friends. Along with the house came a curious object, a towering grandfather clock of dark mahogany, its brass pendulum gleaming, its face adorned with Roman numerals that seemed to leer through the gloom. The solicitor had pressed the keys into Harbury's hand with an odd expression. "The clock is a remarkable piece," he said, "but I would advise you not to wind it." When pressed, he refused to explain further. Harbury dismissed such talk as superstition. He was a man of modern mind, a barrister by trade, and had no patience for ghostly nonsense. That first night, as snow drifted against the windows, he set the pendulum swinging. The deep chime rang through the silent house, steady as a heartbeat. At midnight, however, the clock struck not 12, but 13. The extra chime rolled through the rooms with such force that the glassware trembled in its cabinets. Harbury laughed uneasily and blamed it a mechanical fault. But the following morning brought grim news. His housemaid, young Alice, was found lifeless in her bed, her face pale, her body cold as though winter had crept into her very bones. The household whispered. Harbury silenced them. Yet that night the clock again struck 13. The next day the butler collapsed on the staircase and never rose again. By the third night, dread gnawed at Harbury's nerves. He sat before the clock, lamp burning low, determined to catch the trick of its mechanism. As the hour approached, he held his breath. The pendulum swung. 12 sonorous chimes rang, and then, inevitably, the 13th. With it came a gust of air, though the windows were shut tight, and the unmistakable scent of grave earth. In the wavering lamplight, Harbury thought he saw movement within the glass pane that shielded the pendulum. A face, hollow-eyed, pressing against the glass as though eager to escape. He recoiled, heart hammering, yet he could not bring himself to stop the pendulum swing. The following morning, his cook fled the house in terror, swearing she had heard whispers from the clock, names spoken in a low, deliberate tone, the names of each servant in turn. Alone now, Harbury barricaded himself in the drawing-room. He had not eaten in days. His letters, discovered later, tell of his descent into dread. "The clock calls for me," he wrote. "Each chime is a summons. I feel it counting down, though not to midnight, but to my end." No one saw him alive again. When at last the authorities forced open the door, they found the house empty of servants, its master vanished. Only the clock remained, its pendulum stilled, but the hands pointed to an impossible hour. 13 minutes past 13. The clock was removed and sold at auction, passing from one owner to another. Each household, it is said, suffered sudden deaths until the piece was locked away in a warehouse and forgotten. Yet on quiet winter nights, when the fog curls through Bloomsbury Square, some claim he hear it still, the tolling of a clock long hidden, striking 13, summoning the living to join the company of the dead. Chapter 7. Whispers Along the Railway. Undoubtedly inspired by Victorian fears of new technology, a railway worker sees a spectral figure waving a lantern on the tracks before each accident. At first, he believes it is a warning, but soon he suspects the apparition is not saving lives. It is summoning tragedy. When the great iron rails were first laid across the English countryside, many hailed them as triumphs of modern progress. But there were others, farmers, shepherds, country widows, who muttered that the shrieking engines had disturbed something older than iron and steam, something that had long slept beneath the soil. Samuel Carter, a railway signalman, had no patience for such superstitions. He was a diligent man, stationed in a lonely box along a stretch of track where the moors rolled bleak and endless under the winter sky. His duty was simple: to keep the lamps burning red or green, to warn oncoming trains, to guard the line. But on a December evening, as the fog pressed close and the frost bit through the timbers, Carter heard it for the first time. A whisper, faint as a sigh, carried on the wind. He leaned from his signal box, lantern raised, but saw nothing save the gray swirl of mist. The whisper came again the following night, his name drawn out long and thin. "Carter." His skin prickled. He scoured the embankments with his lantern, certain some vagrant or child was hiding there. Yet there was nothing but frost-coated stones and brambles stiff with ice. Then came the figure. It was late, the hour when the goods train thundered through. Carter, peering into the fog, saw a pale glow moving along the track ahead, as though a lantern were being swung slowly side to side. He seized his own lamp and signaled furiously, thinking it a warning of some obstruction. The train's whistle shrieked, The brakes screamed, sparks flew from the wheels. The driver swore later that he had seen a man on the track, but when the smoke cleared, there was nothing. That night, the train derailed a mile beyond, killing 3 men. The figure returned again and again, always before calamity. A spectral sentinel, swinging its ghostly lamp. At first, Carter believed it a warning, some spirit sent to save lives, but soon the pattern became unmistakable. Wherever the phantom appeared, disaster followed. One evening, as snow fell thick upon the rails, the figure came nearer than ever before. It halted just yards from Carter's box, the lantern swinging, though no hand held it. The whisper rose above the wind. "Carter!" He clutched his head, for the voice seemed inside his skull, cold and insistent. "Carter! Your turn!" Terrified, he stumbled back, his lantern dropping, the flame hissing into the snow. The apparition advanced, and for the first time he saw its face, white as chalk, eyes wide with terror, its mouth frozen in an eternal scream. It was no stranger's face, it was his own. They found the signalman's box empty the next morning. The fire had gone out, his supper uneaten, his chair overturned. On the tracks nearby, the snow was disturbed as though by dragging feet, but no prints led away. Since then, railwaymen speak in hushed tones of the signalman's ghost. On stormy nights, when the fog is thick and the lamps burn dim, they claim a pale figure swings its lantern along the rails, whispering names. And when it calls yours, they say, the next wreck will be your own. So listen closely, traveler, if you ever stand on a winter platform and the wind curls round your ears. If a whisper comes, soft as steam, calling your name, pray that the train arrives swiftly and that you are carried far, far from the line. Chapter 8. The Seance Room. Spiritualism gripped Victorian society, and this tale captures it. A fashionable family hosts a séance for amusement, but when the medium collapses and refuses to speak, the table keeps moving on its own. Something has answered the call and will not leave. In the winter of 1876, the fashionable parlors of London were alive with a peculiar fascination, the summoning of spirits. Spiritualism, they called it, a pastime that promised to reveal the unseen, to bridge the gap between the living and the dead. Few places were more suited to such endeavors than the drawing-room of Lady Ashbourne, whose gilded walls, heavy curtains, and flickering candelabra created shadows eager to be haunted. It was on a particularly bitter December evening that a small group gathered there. Lady Ashbourne herself, her son, a young governess, and a visiting medium named Mr. Thorne. The air smelled of burning tallow and lavender, and the wind rattled against the tall windows as if impatient to enter. Candles were arranged in a circle on the polished oak floor, and the participants joined hands, forming a ring of human warmth and anticipation. "Remember," said Thorne, his voice soft but firm, "we invite only what is willing. The spirits must answer of their own accord." For a time there was only silence. Then came a faint tapping, a single deliberate knock on the wooden floor. Each participant froze, their eyes wide, hearts racing. Another tap followed, then a series, quick and sharp, as though someone or something were counting. Lady Ashbourne gasped. "Is it my late husband?" she whispered. Thorne's lips curled in a tight smile. "Perhaps. Ask a question, and let the spirits reply."
Questions were posed softly, reverently. The knocks answered in kind, forming words through a code of taps. At first it seemed playful, charming even, the novelty of communication with the dead. But soon the taps grew erratic, faster, louder, echoing as if the room itself were trembling. The medium's hands shook. "Do not call too loudly," he warned. But even as he spoke, the candles flickered violently, shadows twisting into impossible shapes along the walls. The ring of participants felt a cold breath pass over them, carrying with it a scent like earth freshly turned in a graveyard. Then the table in the center of the circle lurched upward, tipping on one leg. The candles wavered, throwing elongated specters across the ceiling. A low moan, like wind through a tomb, filled the room. The governess felt hands grip her wrists, though no one was near. Lady Ashbourne's shawl rose as if lifted by an invisible force. Thorne's voice rose in alarm. "It is not safe! The spirit is angry!" But the séance was no longer under human control. The knocks became hammering blows, the table thrashed, and the room seemed to stretch outward into darkness. One by one the participants felt an icy weight pressing upon their chests, and the whispers began, soft at first, then deafening, a chorus of names long dead, calling, demanding recognition. When the candles finally went out, leaving only the pale light of the moon through the tall windows, the room was still. The group sat frozen, trembling, each wondering if they had survived the night or if something had crossed the threshold with them. No harm could be proven, yet each left with a sense of unease that lingered long after the snow had melted from the streets of London. Lady Ashbourne never hosted another séance. The medium disappeared from society's view, rumored to have been found wandering the moors, muttering about voices that would not let him rest. Chapter 9. The Christmas Guest. On Christmas Eve, a large family welcomes a last-minute traveler who arrives half-frozen at their door. He drinks, laughs, and sings with them until midnight. When morning comes, his seat is empty, and snow outside reveals no footprints leading away. It was the evening of December 24th, 1878, and the Snowdon family had gathered in their grand country home to celebrate Christmas Eve. Outside, a gentle snow blanketed the hills, muffling the world in quiet white. Inside, the fire roared in the hearth, filling the drawing room with warmth and the sweet scent of pine boughs. All seemed merry. Candles flickered on the mantel, children hung stockings with care, and the family cat purred atop a velvet chair. The table groaned beneath the weight of roast meats, plum pudding, and spiced cider. Conversation flowed freely, punctuated with laughter that mingled with the crackling fire. Then, at the stroke of 7, there came a knock at the door. Mrs. Snowdon hesitated, frowning. Visitors were not expected in the country at such a late hour, and the snow was deep on the roads. Yet when her husband opened the door, a young man stood there, shoulders dusted with frost, cheeks flushed from the cold. He wore a coat and boots of an earlier fashion, as if he had stepped from another decade. "I'm sorry to intrude, but my carriage was waylaid by the snow. Might I warm myself by your fire for a short while?" The Snowdons, a hospitable family, welcomed him without hesitation. He joined them in the drawing room, shedding snow from his coat and warming his hands by the hearth. His voice was gentle, his smile cordial, and he charmed the children with stories of distant towns and frozen rivers. Yet as the night wore on, a peculiar unease settled over the household. Though the guest laughed and conversed, there was something in his gaze that made the adults uneasy,
eyes that seemed too old, as if he had witnessed a century of Christmases. Occasionally, his hand would brush against a chair or a wall, and the touch left the faintest chill, a creeping frost upon the warmth of the room. At the stroke of midnight, the family raised their glasses for a toast. The stranger stood silently, smiling faintly, and the room seemed to grow colder, though the fire still roared. When the children went to fetch their father to show him a carol book, they returned to find the guest had vanished. The snow outside was pristine, unbroken by footprints, yet his chair sat warm, as though he had only just departed. The family searched every corner of the house, even the stables and cellar, but he was nowhere to be found. The next morning, the village postman delivered a small, folded note. It read only, "Thank you for your kindness. I visit every year, but never twice in the same house." Years passed, and the Snowdons often spoke of that Christmas Eve with a mixture of awe and unease. On snowy nights, the children, grown now, claimed to see a fleeting figure standing at the edge of the woods, watching the house, waiting for another invitation. And so it is said, if a stranger comes knocking on a winter night, polite and warmly dressed, yet slightly out of time, it may not be a traveler at all. It may be a spirit of the season, a visitor from beyond, reminding you that some guests arrive not for food or shelter, but for remembrance and for the quiet chill of the other world. Chapter 10. Echoes in the Winter Dark. A closing reflection that ties all stories together. Winter is a season of endings and beginnings, of silence and whispers. Ghost stories endure not only because spirits linger, but because the living keep calling them back each winter's night. Chapter 11. The Last Visitor. The fire had burned low. The hearth cast long, wavering shadows across the parlor walls, and the last candle guttered as if weary of its own light. Outside, the winter wind rattled the windows and piled snow against the doors. It was a night like any other, the kind in which the stories we have told seemed almost to breathe. It was then that a knock came at the door. At first it was gentle, polite, but insistent enough to disturb the silence. The family, who had spent the evening recounting tales of phantom carriages, frozen brides, and spectral lamplighters, exchanged nervous glances. Visitors were rare this late, and few dared to travel in such snow. Mr. Harcourt, the patriarch, rose cautiously and opened the door. The hall was empty. Snow swirled in the wind, drifting in through the threshold, but no figure stood there. He stepped outside and looked around the moonlit yard. Nothing but footprints from the family's earlier comings and goings. Yet when he returned inside, a new presence awaited him. A man, or perhaps something resembling a man, stood in the middle of the parlor, framed by the dim glow of the dying fire. His coat was old-fashioned, his boots dusted with frost, and a strange lantern swung in his hand. His eyes were dark pools, reflecting the candlelight in a way that seemed almost unnatural. He smiled politely, though it did not reach his eyes. "Good evening," he said, his voice smooth and low, carrying a curious weight. "Might I join you for a moment?" No one moved. The air felt heavier, colder, and the family realized instinctively that this was no ordinary visitor. The children clung to their mother's skirts, and even the dog whimpered, tail tucked between its legs. "I have been traveling far, through roads blanketed in snow, past lamps extinguished by shadows, past clocks that strike 13. He paused, scanning each face. I have listened to your stories tonight, and I have come to offer a parting message. Before anyone could speak, the lantern flickered violently. Shadows writhed along the walls, stretching and twisting into forms recognizable and yet impossible. The gray lady reaching for the governess, the frozen bride wandering the moor, the lamplighter's shadow racing through foggy streets. The fire dimmed, leaving only the cold, pale light of the visitor's lantern. Then, in a voice that was many and one, he whispered, "Remember the dead, speak their names, tell their tales, but beware the visitor who follows, for the last one who knocks may not leave." And just as suddenly as he had appeared, he was gone. No footprints marred the snow, no warmth lingered in the air, no sign remained except the faint, flickering echo of a lantern swinging in the wind. The family huddled together, shaken beyond measure, realizing that their tales of the night had not been contained to paper or hearth. They had invited attention. They had called the attention of something patient, something eternal, something that waited for the next winter night to arrive. And somewhere, on a snowbound lane far from their house, a figure in frost-stiffened clothing waited, swinging a lantern, listening for the sound of footsteps and the soft, eager whispers of the living, who might one day open their door. This chapter works as a final, eerie epilogue, giving the collection a true Victorian twist ending, where the stories themselves seem to summon the supernatural.